resolution, the benefits of the United States participation in the North American Free Trade Agreement outweigh the consequences. We observe that the most significant impacts are those that affect the poor, because every dollar to the poor who struggle to buy basic necessities like food goes much further than every dollar to the rich. Moreover, impacts to the Mexican poor are especially important, because Crozer 2018 of Cambridge University elaborates that over 55 million people live in poverty in Mexico, which offers less services and opportunities than fully developed nations. Contention 1 is achieving affordability. The prices of goods are maintained at lower levels because of NAFTA. As Inc. Encyclopedia writes, before NAFTA, tariffs of 30% or higher on export goods to Mexico were common. NAFTA addresses imbalance by phasing out tariffs over 15 years. Approximately 50% of the tariffs were abolished immediately when the agreement took effect, and the remaining tariffs were targeted for gradual elimination. Tesla away from the CFR writes that trade liberalization between Mexico and the United States has led to a dramatic reduction in prices for Mexican consumers. The cost of basic household goods in Mexico has halved since NAFTA's implementation. In total, these reductions in prices lead to the impact of reducing destitution. As depicted in 2009 from the Carnegie Endowment writes, the amount of Mexicans who could not afford the basic market basket of food, clothing, housing, healthcare, public transportation, and education dropped by 10% from 1992 to 2006. Contention 2 is investment flows. U.S. participation in NAFTA led to a drastic increase in foreign investment to Mexico for two reasons. The first is lowered barriers. According to the Department of Commerce, NAFTA relaxed investment restrictions in Mexico, including local content, trade balancing, market share, and market access requirements. For example, the agreement itself stipulates that each party shall permit all investment transfers such as profits, interest, or capital gains to be made freely and without delay. In addition, these transfers must be permitted to be made in a freely usable currency at the market rate of exchange prevailing. The second is signaled confidence. Walker 2003 of Oregon State University writes that economic integration agreements function as a commitment device. For integration agreements, bind future regimes to reforms undertaken and acts beyond any effects due to specific provisions of the agreement or other determinants. This alleviates the well-known time inconsistency problem whereby countries have an incentive to impose a higher tax rate after investors invest. Thus, trade accords allow a country to sustain a higher level of investment than without it. Therefore, through NAFTA, foreign direct investment flows into Mexico increased drastically, as Cuevas 05 discovered from the World Bank. After controlling for a set of other factors, such as an increase in worldwide FDI flows, the trade agreement is found to generate FDI flows nearly 60% higher than they would have been without the agreement. This leads to two impacts. The first is creating jobs in Mexico. Moran 14 for the Peterson Institute for International Economics writes that employment by affiliates of U.S. firms in Mexico grew from about 553,000 workers in 1990 to 1.34 million in 2011, a net increase of 790,000 jobs. Employment is crucial because it reduces mortality for the poor. As Shore of McGill University writes in 2013, unemployment increases the risk of premature mortality by 63%. The second is transforming the Mexican economy. Transitioning from an agrarian to an industrial economy is the only way to sustainably reduce poverty, which is why Navilla 2006 from the UN explains. Industrialization is essential for economic growth, and rapid economic growth is essential for achieving a reduction in absolute poverty. Across 35 developing countries, the removal of trade protection and manufacturing consistently increases the income of the poorest 60% of the population. Silva of the Wilson Center concludes in 2013. Less than 10% of Mexicans live in extreme poverty for the first time ever, which continues a long-term decline in the levels of extreme poverty and suggests that Mexico has reached a level of economic development that makes it possible to aim for the virtual elimination of extreme poverty within the next decade. For all these reasons, we urge an affirmative action.
Okay, we're going to run some prep time starting, or give me a second. Starting, yeah. All right, we'll stop now. That was 30 seconds.
So this is the monitor, right?
Yes.
Everyone's good? All right. Why should I negate the resolution? Our sole contention is halting Mexico's development. Prior to NAFTA, Mexico was on a path to sustainable, long-term development. As Mark Riesbroek, director of the Center for Economic and Policy Research 14 explains, Mexico's program of planned industrial development, domestic enterprise, and rigid social programs brought record levels of growth in the years before NAFTA. From 1960 to 80, Mexico's GDP per capita doubled, amounting to huge increases in living standards for the vast majority of Mexicans. If the country had continued to grow at this rate, as nations like South Korea did, it would be living in European levels today. Simultaneously, Mexico used a gradual approach to open itself to the world market while protecting national industries. As Cordova of Brookings Institution 03 explains, following the 1982 debt crisis, Mexico began gradually liberalizing its economy, eventually eliminating trade licenses and simplifying tariffs. During this period, the Library of Congress finds that Mexico diversified its exports, moved towards self-sufficiency in food and most consumer goods, and expanded domestic production. Unfortunately, NAFTA brought this development to a halt, plunging Mexico headfirst into the global economy with no regulation or protection of domestic industry. As Riesbroek writes, NAFTA brought Mexico's industrial and developmental policies to an end, enshrining rapidly deregulated trade and investment in a binding agreement. Specifically, Rocha, the Institute for Policy Studies 14 writes that under NAFTA, corporations were granted the legal power to sue the Mexican government whenever it passed policies that could interfere with corporate profits. This resulted in a chilling effect where the Mexican government was effectively blackmailed out of passing further reforms that served the public interest. Instead, NAFTA reversed progress and electrocuted the Mexican economy in two key ways, and the first is destroying domestic industry. Without any domestic regulation, NAFTA's rapid shift to trade allowed American multinational corporations to quickly take over Mexico's key industries, destroying jobs for the poor and working class. As Rocha writes, NAFTA has unequivocally been a net job destroyer for Mexico, as companies like Walmart have displaced scores of smaller businesses, causing more than 600,000 companies to go bankrupt during the current administration alone. For example, in the agricultural sector, Riesbroek finds roughly 5 million permanent farm jobs were lost to American agricultural monopolies, displacing workers into poverty. Thus, he concludes the Mexican unemployment rate has averaged roughly 5% under NAFTA, whereas in the pre-NAFTA age, it was only 3%. The second is financial dependency. As Riesbroek explains, because Mexican institutions were still developing when NAFTA was enacted, the deal increasingly tied the country to American investment, meaning any recession would hit Mexico harder as the U.S. would pull all of this money out of the market. Indeed, financial crisis in 94, 01, and 08 all had the most severe impact on Mexico compared to any other region. Lang-Reuter 17 verifies that Mexican dependence on America's economy pushed an additional 5 million people into poverty during the 08 recession alone. Worst of all, this dependence means that shocks in the prices of basic goods, which used to be stable under NAFTA, are now highly volatile. NYT17 writes that under NAFTA, Mexican consumers now pay more for food in general, while price spikes in the international market have pushed millions of other countries more into starvation. For these two reasons, Roderick of Harvard University 17 concludes, almost all of the world's developing countries' success stories, China, Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, avoided rapid globalization and instead used a gradual approach to liberalization, with the government playing an active role in restructuring the economy and buffering it against volatile markets. Riesbroek furthers that since 2000, Mexico's economy has grown at less than half the rate of the rest of Latin America. While most of its neighboring countries have implemented developmental policies that cut the overall rate of poverty by 1/3, Mexico has made no progress whatsoever, with its poverty rate changing by less than 0.1% since NAFTA was implemented. In other words, given Mexico's roughly 60 million people under the poverty line, NAFTA prevented the country from lifting tens of millions of people into the middle class. Thus, we need it.
Someone ready? So, the great boundary contention, you compare Mexico to the rest of Latin America.
Yeah.
Why is it justifiable to just say, oh, the rest of Latin America had a lot of growth, and therefore Mexico should be seen as that?
Yeah, sure. So before NAFTA was implemented, Mexico and other Latin American countries, and specifically the ones in our evidence that we're talking about, were on the same developmental path of gradual liberalization. And we argue that if you look at the comparative analysis between those other countries and Mexico, the only difference is that Mexico took a full neoliberal approach with NAFTA.
So
and the growth between the two, really, one more sentence, right, is that they cut their poverty by 1/3, while Mexico remains stagnant.
What happened in 1993 and 1994 exclusively in Mexico's economy?
A lot happened. The peso crisis happened in
Peso crisis,
1994.
right? So my question to you then is, aren't there unique engagements and unique parts of Mexico that make it different from the rest of Latin
I mean,
America?
I agree. It's an analogy.
Okay,
There are
so
better parts
if you don't
to
win
our
the
case.
warrants, just because the statistic is true that the reduction in poverty was 5 times less than the rest of Latin America, that's not a
I
comparison
mean,
of
if
whether
you
or
don't
not.
win the warrants in any debate, you lose the argument.
Right,
So
okay,
I
just
don't
make this
understand
very
what you're
clear
saying.
that your comparison in and of itself is not a reason to vote for you.
But yeah, sure, yeah, that makes
No
sense.
question.
Yeah. So your numbers about poverty, what international organization came up with these numbers?
So I cite the Council of Foreign Relations in
Yeah.
2008.
And what study are those?
I think they're using the ECLAC data.
ECLAC and the UN data, right?
Yeah.
So how do they organize their measurements of poverty?
I think they use it by poverty line or like
Yeah.
based off of the
So
basic
is that a
market.
Mexico specific standard or a global standard?
The ECLAC specifically measures Latin America and the specific market baskets of each individual country. So yes.
That's not true.
Okay,
Their
so
global poverty line is the same for most
For the
most
UN
countries.
generally,
and they
it's
also
$1,
measure things,
$1.5.
yes, and they also measure things like extreme poverty,
Mhm.
which is way below the line for any other
and
measurement.
so-
which is why when you look at Mexico's personal measurement of their poverty rates, nothing has changed since NAFTA's implementation.
So-
So they are accounting for their own goods and their goods in their own sectors.
Just because right now the poverty rates are the same as before NAFTA
Mhm.
doesn't mean that poverty rates wouldn't have been higher absent a world with NAFTA.
I think that's very easy to argue that would be
Okay.
true.
Wait,
Like that's
so-
the warrants in my case, right? I think gradual liberalization and not forcing them headfirst into an unequal playing ground with big countries would be terrible. And like ways that this can be proven true is that if you look towards other countries, and again the warrant debate is the 4 minutes of my
Right.
case, but I'm giving you similar analogies, right? Like China, like Taiwan, like South Korea, right? When they had gradual liberalization outside the U.S., where they kept consumer goods with tariffs, but capital goods, they lifted these tariffs, like Mexico was doing.
So if
They
I-
all had success stories, while
if I-
Mexico did the opposite and
In
failed.
fact, Mexico voluntarily chose to join NAFTA.
Yeah, that was a bad
And
decision.
so-
So vote nay.
Wait a second. Just because, my argument here is that Mexico voluntarily chose to join NAFTA, meaning that it wasn't like they were forced to liberalize extremely quickly. Rather, this
Yeah,
huge
they
policy paradigm of fast liberalization was something the Mexican government was
that's just
pursuing
like a
since
semantic of
1980.
words. Like they were forced to because they voluntarily signed on to NAFTA. I'm saying in a world where they didn't use the gradual approach would have been much more beneficial. And the easiest way you can see is that they've done nothing in the past 25 years.
Aaron?
For the judges, can we just straight down that case now and ready? Great. Start with their own contention about Mexico developing. First, as an overview to this entire contention, the bulk of their evidence in this contention is contingent on evidence, for example, the widespread evidence from the CEPR claiming that Mexico's growth and poverty reduction is slower than the rest of Latin America. But we would argue that evidence like this is not a good indicator of whether or not NAFTA has been good because it's not causal. Just because something happened to Mexico after NAFTA does not necessarily mean that it was because of NAFTA. So, since both sides are basically impacting to the same impact, which is poverty reduction and economic growth lifting people out of poverty, then the focus on debate should really just be whoever's winning the warrants, the reasons as to why NAFTA might be comparatively better than a world without NAFTA. And the Peter Institute in 2018 explains that absent NAFTA, even though Mexico's economic growth post-NAFTA has been below average, without NAFTA, it likely would have been close to zero or perhaps even negative. Comparing with the entirety of Latin America is simply not a fair comparison because each country has different circumstances that affect their economies. With that in mind, let's go to the impacts of the specific warrants they gave you in their case. The first thing they tell you is that domestic industries are being crowded out because these multinational corporations are reducing the amount of jobs available. But first, we would argue that on net, these multinational corporations are going to be creating much more jobs because the jobs that they were replacing in these traditional industries were falling in productivity. What Boley of the McKinsey Global Institute in 2016 explains is that if you look at post-NAFTA, the firms in which there's been high amounts of foreign direct investment have been increasing their productivity by about 6.5% a year. But these smaller traditional firms without that much investment were seeing decreased productivity of about 4.8%, which clearly means that absent this foreign investment, the rest of the Mexican economy very likely would have seen the same fate as many of these declining traditional industries without the same amount of foreign investment. That's the first reason you can vote for us. Then second, they say that you're seeing really high unemployment rates right now. But we would argue that this is not because of NAFTA, because you go into the World Bank in 2001, who explains that the bulk of this increase in unemployment was simply due to the Mexican government's own decision to switch towards a more industrial economy by importing more agriculture. They're going to say that this displaced a lot of small farmers. However, this is the reason why this is not true. The World Bank continues that the provisions of NAFTA actually allowed Mexico to implement what's known as a tariff rate quota, in which above a certain amount, they can actually impose tariffs on select sensitive goods like corn and other products. The Mexican government chose not to do this, which clearly means a lot of the harm that they're attributing to NAFTA aren't actually a result of NAFTA whatsoever. Instead, we tell you the comparison is very simple. In a world with NAFTA, even though you're seeing an increase in unemployment, at least there are almost 1 million new manufacturing jobs that these displaced workers can go to. In a world without NAFTA, you still see these agricultural workers displaced, but they don't have these manufacturing jobs to go to. So just saying unemployment goes up is not really a fair comparison. Then second, they tell you that it's making the Mexican government dependent on the United States financial economies. We would argue first and foremost, this entire argument is essentially backwards. It's like saying that Mexico would be best suited if it were purely a subsistence agriculture society with no connection to the rest of the world. Even if there's more general volatility, we would argue on balance, more trade with things like more exports means that your own economy is more resilient to internal shocks because you're not nearly as reliant on your own domestic firms. But let's go to some of the examples. The first thing they reused is that in 2008, they saw a large increase in poverty due to the U.S. financial crisis. But what the Council on Foreign Relations actually explains is that Mexico saw a very fast recovery. In just 2 years, their growth had returned back to what it had been before the recession took place. So a lot of the recession impacts simply aren't very important in the context of the round. Moreover, we would argue the increase in resiliency as a result of more exports is a reason why you're going to be affirming. Because the IMF finds that, for example, during the 1982 Mexican financial crisis, it took Mexico about 7 years to recover back into international credit markets. But in the 1994 peso crisis, it took them only about 7 months. So we would argue more integration with developed countries like the United States is good for poverty reduction and general economic growth. Then finally, they say that from the New York Times, Mexicans are paying more for food. Again, this is not because of NAFTA. What the Financial Times in 2018 explains is that actually you're seeing rampant inflation in Mexico for a lot of reasons. For example, the fact that the Mexican government can no longer afford subsidies for fuel, which is why fuel prices increased by 20%. This clearly has nothing to do with NAFTA. If tariffs are lower, then definitely consumer prices would still be comparatively lower in a world with NAFTA. For these reasons, we strongly urge you to affirm.
We'll call it like an hour. 10 seconds.
Why is it BS?
Okay, fine. Yeah.
It's true.
Like 40 seconds.
I think it's true.
It's going to go their case, our case. Is everyone ready? Let's start time now. Beginning with the framework, they say Mexican poverty is the most important. We agree. Let's go to their first contention, which deals with decreasing prices. The first thing they tell you is that tariffs were common before NAFTA, and NAFTA got rid of tariffs. Here's the problem. From the 1980s onwards, Mexico was already reducing tariffs at a gradual rate. In fact, in 1985, Mexico signed into the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT, which today is called the World Trade Organization, and operates with tariffs below 5% for almost every single developing country in the world. This is important because the Harvard Business Review in 2016 finds that even without NAFTA, the level of trade coming into Mexico would have been relatively the same, and economists are in agreement that the amount of GDP worth of trade that Mexico would have missed out on is about 1 year's worth of GDP, which is not a lot. The only thing that changed with NAFTA was the pace at which liberalization occurred, because NAFTA went all in for neoliberal globalization without having domestic institutions to back themselves up. This non-uniques their argument about decreasing prices. The second big problem with this argument is that their calculations are really bad. The New York Times finds that the reason you see decreases in prices is because the type of goods Mexico is importing is now far lower in quality. For example, in food, the dominant share of the diet in Mexico used to be staple goods like corn and rice, but today it's all processed food like Twinkies and Cheetos, and so the price might be lower by the index that they use, but that doesn't mean that the actual food that Mexicans want is getting cheaper. In fact, the Global Trade Watch in 2014 did an analysis of the average Mexican minimum wage worker and found that for that worker, their $1 goes about 38% less far towards buying their basic needs after NAFTA when accounting for the changes in their wages and the changes in prices. That means that the average poor person in Mexico is a lot poorer. The warrants for this are pretty simple. There was an increase in monopolization in NAFTA, which means that large companies can charge more and nobody can say anything. And second, they were tied to volatile markets which shocked the prices of goods like food to record high levels. The final thing is with their calculations about poverty. They say that poverty was reduced by 10%, but this uses the UN's $2 per day poverty line. ECLAC calculates it that way, and the problem with this line is that A, the price of goods that they use is a global price. So if prices drop in China overall, it might sound like poverty went down in Mexico, and 2, it doesn't account for Mexican purchasing power. In fact, A, we tell you that Mexico's poverty line saw no change, and B, the CEPR finds that even under the UN line, the rest of Latin America outperformed Mexico by a factor of about 2.5 in the time that NAFTA was in place. Let's go to contention 2, which deals with investment. Here they're saying that we liberalized FDI, which allowed Mexico to develop. The problem comes from Chu Nguyen of the University of Houston in 2016, which finds that in the year before NAFTA, 1993, Mexico was the leading Latin American country and viewed as a model for industrial development for the rest of the world. They were already industrializing at a rapid pace because where FDI was not present, they had domestic industries filling the void. Today, Mexico is 18th of 20 Latin American countries by measures of human development. So you can see where they fell off. They're just trying to say that NAFTA was an end-all be-all. Their first impact here is creating jobs, but their evidence here just says that employment by American firms went up. We tell you that employment by Mexican firms went down, and overall the unemployment rate under NAFTA was 5% on average, whereas before was 3% on average, so you've seen that net job loss because domestic industries were destroyed. Their second impact is that industrialization is critical, but again, that was happening at the same rate prior to NAFTA. Let's go to our case. Their first argument is that we should look to the warrants, and then they come up here and read a right-wing think tank with absolutely no warrants saying that growth would be negative before NAFTA. That's a bit of a contradiction, but what we tell you is that Mexico would have followed the same development path that it was before because that is exactly what they wanted. The reason they even joined NAFTA is because the IMF actually compelled them to do so through what were called structural adjustment policies, where they said that if you don't join a program like NAFTA, we will cut you off. So if you want to talk about the specifics, NAFTA and the US's role in the IMF was probably a bad thing. But then, the first thing they say is that productivity increased in the businesses that have FDI and went down in other businesses. First of all, we would argue that those gains only went to the rich. But second, we would argue that the businesses that saw decreasing productivity were probably the Mexican businesses that were being destroyed by NAFTA. They only went down because of NAFTA. Then they say that the World Bank says that the decision to bring in agriculture was Mexico's fault, but that decision was facilitated by NAFTA. It could not happen without NAFTA. Finally, they make these arguments about how 2008 was a fast recovery, but 2008 wouldn't have been a problem without NAFTA, and a lot of these recessions would not have been problems because they were American recessions that spread to Mexico through NAFTA. So at the end of the day, they're just solving problems that they created. Vote neg.
So first in rebuttal, you say that these U.S. multinational corporations have monopoly power in Mexico, right?
Yes.
So why is this true?
Because they come in. Mexico doesn't have any regulation saying they can't, or that domestic industries get.
Wait, like we agree that they're coming in. Of course, there's more investment by large corporations. But why does this give them monopoly power? What are like the barriers?
Because they can outcompete Mexican industries.
With what? Lower
You're talking
prices,
about
right?
no, because they get higher subsidies from the U.S. federal government.
So
5 times higher subsidies.
Walmart gets subsidized by the U.S. government.
Well, agriculture gets subsidized.
Okay, wait. This is different. We're talking about like firms, right? Like agriculture is
okay,
different.
So you're saying that they have lower prices, so
Yeah.
Mexico loses their business.
Well, I'm asking you the reason. Is it because they have lower prices?
Again, like we say that they have other competitive advantages. Prices could be one, but we would argue that even if they have temporarily lower prices, for example, food prices dropped in the first 4 years after NAFTA because these big companies come in. Once they control 98% of the agricultural market share, they gradually increase those prices, which is why today they are higher than 1994.
Well, we argue the reason food prices are on the rise is because of inflation due to things like no longer being able to afford fuel subsidies.
Let's talk about subsidies. Yeah. So subsidies are a developmental policy that countries adopt to help domestic industries,
but those
right?
That a 20% increase in fuel price was not something that happened in the 90s. It was something that happened just a few years ago.
No,
So clearly it was not something that NAFTA outlawed.
You're giving an example, right? But I want to talk about subsidies broadly, right? Because Mexico had a pretty rigid programs of subsidies that was keeping prices low, and they had to eliminate that under the terms of NAFTA, to be clear.
So to be clear, what I read you in rebuttal is that NAFTA is not some program that forced, for example, the Mexican government not to have any of these subsidies.
Didn't it definitionally do that?
No, for example, with corn, for example, we tell you that actually NAFTA gave a provision in which the Mexican government was able to...
That was an exception, but I'm talking about...
No, actually there were many sensitive goods that these tariffs could have been applied to, and the Mexican government chose not to.
Okay,
So their mentality is we want to lower
so
prices to industrialize.
To
At least in the
clarify,
they have more manufacturing.
Really quickly, if I'm going to be clear, right? There are a couple of things. First of all, you just saying Mexico wasn't smart about NAFTA doesn't get you offense. Because that means that without NAFTA, they wouldn't have made that decision in the first place, right? Subsidies would have stayed in place.
Wait, no, I'm
The
saying that's not
second-
because of NAFTA. That's
No,
fair.
but the thing is, right, is that the reason they dropped subsidies was because under NAFTA, that was the only way they could convince investors to put money in Mexico.
No, when you're importing corn, it's not like if they had subsidies, then the United States government just like wouldn't export any corn to them. That
No,
doesn't
no, no,
make
we're
sense.
saying that they would not invest money into Mexico.
Yeah, so now you're talking about a different argument. I was talking about the agriculture.
I'm saying that the reason subsidies went away was NAFTA. You're trying to paint it as Mexico wanted to get
Wait,
rid
we're
of subsidies
talking
on their
about
own.
two different arguments, right? For example, yes, there are
Okay.
less protective tariffs for example.
Regardless, I think subsidies are like one cause. I think
Yeah.
we're making clear analysis on the other reasons why prices went up. Can I have a
Yeah,
question?
yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so you talk about how they recovered from the peso crisis quickly, right?
Yeah.
So they recovered in terms of investment faster under the peso crisis, but how long did it take them to recover in terms of GDP, which is what probably matters more?
I don't know how long.
It took the same amount of time as the 1980s crisis.
Wait, hold
before
on. The
NAFTA.
1994 peso crisis, just to be clear, this is right after what you read in case as this massive period of record level growth before they joined NAFTA, right?
No, that was 1982.
Yeah, so just a few years later.
Yeah, it was caused because
recession.
Mexico devalued the peso to get investment under NAFTA. That's what Ishan's about to tell you in summary.
Yeah,
It's all true. I'm sure this is true. I'm just not sure if it will continue. It wouldn't have. Yeah, but none of it is untrue. See, that's the problem. It's a probability factor. Is that the PRI? That's what our F case is. Yeah. You should look at a book tonight. I was reading a guy named John Charles Justine called Born in Blood and Fire. The last chapter is like really good on the topic. It'll help out your Okay, thank you. Oh, I almost got my voice. It was fun. Yeah. I don't know what to expect. We haven't had a staff meeting, so I talked to Bob Dolan. He's like, I don't really know what I'm doing. That's a good sign, I guess.
So ready? Wait a second. Okay. Judge is ready. Starting off with the negative, remember the jobs in the industries that were lost would have happened anyways, and that's for two reasons. The first one is it was by choice, because NAFTA didn't force them to not have these tariffs, rather it allowed provisions for them to impose their own tariffs. That's from the World Bank, which explains that what that means is that Mexico would have still had this type of liberalization and still would have had these things in these industries pushed out anyways. But then secondly, all these traditional industries they try to talk about have the same fate because of lower productivity. Productivity has nothing to do with free trade. It rather suggests that these industries were not able to produce as much, meaning they're less profitable. That means these industries would have fallen out of favor anyways. But in the bottom case, they try to say that you wouldn't have this recession absent NAFTA, they wouldn't be exposed to the 2008 recession. What the IMF does is it compares. There was a 7-year recovery in 1982, but there's a 7-month recovery. Every single country was affected by the 2008. It wasn't that Mexico would not have been affected absent NAFTA. But then let's move to our case. The problem here is that they try to say there's going to be slow growth, and development. But Masaccio explains, from 1989 to 1994, these same slow growth and rampant growth that they try to talk about led to a recession in 1994. That's because all the growth wasn't actually because of sustainable development. It was instead because of extreme governmental spending that led to the recession in 1994. What that means is that their comparison, that there's going to be a slow amount of growth, is completely unrelated whatsoever. But then they non-unique the entire round here by saying the increase in trade would have happened anyways. That means the industries would have been pushed out, the same tariffs would have been released. What that means is that every single impact in their case and our contention one is completely non-unique. But the only uniqueness comes from our contention two on our second one, the signal of confidence. What's made from Wall Street explaining, independent of unilateral policies for liberalization, by implementing the NAFTA trade agreement, it led to increased investor confidence because it committed them and it created a commitment device that increased, as Cuevas explains, FDI flows by 60%. What this ultimately means is that all the job losses, all the problems they talk about would have happened either way. But NAFTA uniquely allowed the increase in investment by 60% that led to 790,000 jobs from Iran 14. That is extremely crucial because while they may say that poverty might be just doing super poorly or employment might be doing super poorly, all these factors would be significantly worse because they wouldn't have at least almost 1 million jobs to work to, these manufacturing jobs to go to. That's comparatively a better world for the poor.
We're gonna start some.
Can I see the evidence that NAFTA could still select tariffs?
Oh yeah, the selective
Sorry,
tariffs.
Mexico could still select tariffs under NAFTA.
What's the first response to what? That he extended. The first response that he extended. Extended 2 pieces of defense on multinationals taking jobs, and then he responded to the 2008 stuff with the resilience he faced. He responded to the big overview about how the only thing that changed was the pace by saying that that means everything in the net case is also non-union. And then he said that the all-union commitment is a binding commitment, and the unique offense is binding commitment.
This is just for crops, right?
Yeah, well, that's one.
I just want to see the general thing.
Yeah. Yeah, this is.
Okay, that's fine. We're good. What's your...
That's 1 minute. I think it's 1:05.
Yeah, so it's been total usage of 145. There.
Alright. Is everyone good? Alright. It's going to start. It's going to start on our case, productivity, domestic industry. Alright. The first things my opponents have said is that productivity decreases with their unwarranted conservative thinking card. But let's look at why we're right in today's debate. Their biggest warrant comes from the fact that they can do selective tariffs and that helps them out. But they have to understand that that is our advocacy. The defense that they read in rebuttal is literally a turn towards their case. They say it's really bad that they had rapid industrialization, which is the definition of NAFTA. Their evidence is only about corn crops, which we will concede maybe went up in prices, but every other industry, 600,000 companies went bankrupt, and we had 5 million farmers pushed into poverty without that. So we can completely concede this. This is a turn towards their case. It's deadly that they ran this argument. The second thing I have to go is to our financial dependency argument. They say a couple of things. The first thing that they say is that we had without this, they would have been completely isolated. This is simply not true. They're ignoring the whole advocacy of gradual liberalization. Then he says, we recovered in 2 years, and the 82 crisis was longer. This is wrong for a couple of reasons. The first is that the recovery would not be necessary if NAFTA didn't create the problem in the first place. Specifically with the crisis, the only reason it exists, according to Neely in 2016, is because they were trying to devalue the currency in order to prospect future investors. And that's why they did things like decreasing subsidies. The alternative cause that he reads are reasons stemming off of NAFTA existing in the first place. We would not have any of this if NAFTA was never even created or the thought of it. Now on our case, a couple of specific things. He says slow growth, again, is the reason why our HBR chart is wrong. I just responded to this. The second thing he tries to say is that we can increase investor confidence and that we not need our entire case. This is wrong for a couple of reasons. The only unique things left in the round are twofold. The first is ISDS, what we say in case. We say that NAFTA created a system where corporations can sue governments and the whole prospect of corporate profits taking away public goods. The second thing that is unique in today's debate is investor confidence, which they say. And our whole point is that because they have to appeal to investor confidence, that is the only reason NAFTA is created. They're forced to not rely on these provisions. Because if they do, then they lose their investor funding. And that's why they said a whole point of NAFTA and that system has led to a corruption and monopolies expanding. A really key term you have to extend is that these monopolies have made it so that 38% of their income is worth less, food prices are increasing, and Mexicans are being pushed into poverty. It is for these reasons that I urge a negative vote. Thank you.
Okay, let's start now.
How about the devaluation of the peso in 1994? Right?
Yeah.
Wait, what?
The devaluation
Yeah,
of the peso. So why did they devalue the peso?
They devalued the peso while they were like literally negotiating NAFTA
Yeah.
to get the investment right after
in
NAFTA
January,
started.
in response to the rebellion that created the tequila crisis, right?
Wait, what? It was
So
not in
here's-
response
let's-
to a
let's
rebellion.
break
No,
down-
no,
guys,
it's not.
Let's
Let's
not
break
change the
down.
record on history in Grand Cross, right?
No.
The reason they
Let's
devalued
break down
the peso, and there have been official Mexican documents released when they were planning this, right? Is because if they lowered the value of the peso, then the moment NAFTA was signed, they would get loss of investment. But what happened is that investors actually lost confidence in Mexico when NAFTA was signed, and so they liquidated their investment, and that caused the peso to fall 50% against the dollar,
So let's
which
make
created
this
that big recession you
This is
talked
the
about.
I'm reading this
We're
off of the
writing.
Massachusetts evidence. Essentially, because there was too much governmental spending, investors drew their money away. This capital flight, where investors drew their money away, led to Mexico being desperate for investment.
Yeah, but that was
That
after
forced
NAFTA.
them to devalue the peso.
Wait,
no,
It is
no,
not
no.
because of
All
NAFTA.
that
Dude,
shows is that all
guys,
the evidence
guys,
on record
really
was-
quickly-
It's just revisionist history.
Let's be real. I want to make one thing really clear here. The reason the investors pulled their money out, and you say there was too much spending, that was all after NAFTA was
1989
implemented.
to 1994.
Yeah.
That's the
What?
statistics.
That is
That
during
was
the negotiations.
like right after
and during
NAFTA
the
was
implementation of
implemented.
NAFTA.
They were like, we don't like the way Mexico was going before NAFTA.
Let's talk
We're
about-
pulling our money out.
They devalue the peso, it's simple economics. If you devalue the peso, it's
Yeah,
more
because
easy
they
for
wanted
foreign
to attract
investors
more
to get
investment
great
because of
investment.
a capital flight. But let's talk about recession.
So you understand that that would not exist with
No.
slower, gradual
Probably
liberalization.
because
They would not have the
January of
incentive to
1994.
devalue to the peso to the extent where they had no international
Let's
reserves.
talk about recessions.
Like you can devalue the
So-
peso without going
Wait,
into a
actually,
crisis.
can we
Recession
have a
happened
question
because-
really quick?
Go ahead.
Yeah, before we talk about recessions. Okay, so since you guys have basically dropped the idea of prices going down, which we thought was the most important to poverty, but I guess not anymore, what is the terminal impact of this signal to investors, which you say is the only unique
Right,
thing?
the
More
increase in jobs.
More jobs compared to
More jobs. Okay, so then where are you showing me a net increase in jobs? Because we showed a net decrease.
Wait, all your evidence about like net jobs is just saying like afterwards their unemployment rate.
No, no, no. The
That-
evidence-
like, you
the
can't-
evidence
that's
is
not
specific
even
to
evidence
NAFTA.
like Just by saying like after 30 years
I did not even
unemployment.
extend
The evidence
general
the evidence is specific to NAFTA, and it says that it was a net job destroyer, that 600,000 businesses were
Wait,
shut.
not because of the post.
Like the evidence says it's specific to NAFTA, but all they literally do is calculate the unemployment rate.
No,
now.
I did not
That's a
extend that
different
evidence.
piece of
I did not
evidence.
extend that evidence because it was not causal.
So a recession happened because, like in 2008, for example, because they lost their growth in the United States, right?
Yeah.
So what that means is that absent the trade, they wouldn't have had the growth to begin
No,
with, right?
No, no, no. What we're saying is
So
that
they
yes,
would've been a
recession
diversified-
spread across borders no matter what.
Yeah.
What we're saying is that because of NAFTA, there was an additional 5 million people pushed into poverty because they didn't have domestic institutions of their own when they joined NAFTA, so they became ultra dependent on American money. So when a recession happens in America, we pull our money out of everywhere, and that means that Mexico is hit doubly hard. So 5 million more people
That's
go
the
into poverty.
HBR warrant that you misunderstood, and that's why you said our case was not unique. Our point is that it leads to diversification through gradual liberalization. That's been the advocacy since constructed.
That's assuming that America is still participating in NAFTA. If America doesn't, for example, start signing NAFTA in 1992, then the things that happened after 1992 but before 1994 don't happen. Because Bush signed it before Clinton.
The first main issue in Iran is this idea of recessions and dependency. They try to say that the only reason Mexico even entered the peso crisis was because during NAFTA renegotiations, they wanted to validate the peso currency. That is not true. Remember what Jerry Masato in 2016 from Harvard, who explains that actually the reason why the peso was devalued was because the period of high growth prior to 1994, for example, in the late 80s, which they themselves say was this record level of growth, was fueled only by high levels of government spending and consumption. And so, in order to attract more investment, then when the bank's rate is interest rates, that causes devaluation of the peso. The implication of this is twofold. One, it means their idea that we caused these recessions is not true. And B, it also means that all of their evidence about how Mexico has been underperforming in the years since NAFTA was passed is really not attributed to NAFTA because they uniquely had this one recession compared to the other Latin American countries. So you cannot attribute this to NAFTA. Then their next argument is about domestic industries being crowded out. They really mishandled the Bowley evidence about productivity. They say the reason productivity is going down is because all these small traditional firms are going bankrupt. But they're not understanding what productivity is. Productivity is relating to how much output is created as a function of how much input is created. We would say the reason that productivity is on a decline is clearly because these traditional industries were just far less advanced and far less likely to expand in the future, which is why you see the firms that NAFTA invested in, and you saw a 6.5% rise in productivity compared to a 4.8% fall in productivity for the firms without as much NAFTA investment. This clearly means that compared to a world without NAFTA, we're seeing more job growth and more business creation. So that's going to be why we're voting for the affirmative is our second contention on investment flows. They're essentially conceding a war on signal confidence, increasing the net amount of foreign direct investment into Mexico by 60%. This is crucial because their only response to this is twofold. First, they say monopolies and prices are going up. That's not true at all. We tell you that prices are going up only in the status quo because of the high levels of fuel prices as a result of inflation due to not being able to impose fuel subsidies. When they can see that tariffs are going down, that clearly means prices will be going down. That doesn't make any sense. But more importantly, the more evidence says that these U.S. affiliate firms are now employing 790,000 more jobs compared to the world in which NAFTA was not in place. And we say the reason this is true is because those millions of people who are displaced would have left the workforce anyway, but at least now they have comparatively almost 1 million new jobs in manufacturing to turn to. So on balance, you're benefiting the poor people of Mexico. Thus, we urge you to affirm.
Yeah. Okay. We'll just we have 15 more seconds. I'm gonna use that right now. Okay. Hang on. Yeah.
Yes, but the negotiation was, so this is like, but you're right. They're not explaining. They devalue
All three judges.
or for America to
Time starts now. I'm going to follow the format of their speech mostly. So there are a lot of issues relating to Mexican development, and we're going to go in the same order they did. The first thing here is recessions. We see that the quantity and severity of recessions went up. In 1994, they talk about how it was caused by high spending, but the problem is high spending only became an issue under NAFTA because now the investors, which we point out they were beholden to under NAFTA, and this investor-state dispute settlement, which says that you can be sued if you don't do what the corporations want, that's when spending becomes an issue, and they say you cannot spend anymore, you have to take our investment. That's what caused the devaluation of the peso, which is why the extension that they make was a card that was first brought up in Grand Crossfire. So that's the first recession. On the 2008 recession, they say this would have happened either way, we agree, but it was 5 million more people in poverty because they were extra dependent on America because they did not have domestic industries of their own. At best, you get a little bit faster recovery, but at worst, you're seeing much more recession happening. At worst, this is going to be a wash for them. The real thing here, when they talk about productivity, there are two problems. The first of which is the Harvard evidence, which is cold extended, which tells you that this productivity in trade was happening at the same rate before NAFTA. The difference was it was all at once versus gradual liberalization. So their impacts are not unique to voting for them. The change is in the pace of industrialization, and that's what we're talking about here. We also give you the two evidence saying that in terms of industrial development, Mexico used to lead Latin America and the world for developing countries. Now they are 18th out of 20. So they have fallen behind because of this rapid industrialization. No unique impact. The final thing they talk about is foreign direct investment. They say prices just went up because of fuel prices. We tell you three things. Number one, the only reason things like subsidies went away is because A, they were beholden to these investors, and B, they were beholden to these lawsuits. The second thing we tell you is that the monopolization of their industries is a real reason that prices went up. And the third thing we tell you is that the tying to our volatile markets is why they went up. They completely concede the idea that the price for an average Mexican minimum wage worker to buy basic goods today is 40% higher roughly than it was before NAFTA, which is why poverty has not moved one bit since NAFTA was implemented. Employment is down when you factor in the overall Mexican businesses, and the rest of Latin America cut poverty by 1/3 using the policies that Mexico used to use. At the end of the day, both of us get impacts to trade, but we're the only team that gets impacts to development and empowering the poor, and for that reason that we are incredibly proud to negate.
job, guys.